Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are not just skimming the surface. We are undertaking what feels like a fundamental excavation.
That's a good way to put it.
The source material we have is, well, it's a truly monumental stack of philosophical research and some deeply transformative teachings from Osho.
Right.
And they address nothing less than the core human experience. What it means to be free, how the ego operates, the nature of love, and, what consciousness truly is.
That's right. What the listener has provided here is a remarkably cohesive vision. And it's not simply a self-help guide or a list of tips.
Not at all.
It's a radical challenge to nearly every accepted definition of success, morality, and even spirituality that, modern industrialized society adheres to. It really forces you to look inward.
And to realize that most of what you think of as freedom is actually just a reaction to something else.
Precisely. A reaction, not a true state of being.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to move systematically through these concepts. We're going to try and define the three dimensions of freedom, understand why the ego is seen as this fundamental tension.
Right, this conflict at our core.
And grasp the profound difference between the act of doing meditation and achieving a state of being meditative. We're looking for, the operating system that exists before all the societal programming gets installed.
The original face, as some of the sources might call it.
Let's start with freedom. It's a word that gets thrown around so much, but it's rarely understood in its full depth. The material breaks it down into these distinct, necessary stages. The first and most basic is this preparatory phase, freedom from.
This is the essential first step, but it's so crucial to recognize its nature. It's inherently reactive. It's past-oriented.
What do you mean by reactive?
Well, freedom from is all about breaking the chains that bind you. It's the rebellion against what society or history has imposed on you.
Like your nationality or the church?
Exactly. Or a specific political dogma, your race, restrictive family expectations, all of it. And when you succeed in this initial break, the sources describe this feeling of immense lightness.
I can imagine. A weight off your shoulders.
A huge weight. You feel good because this heavy burden has been lifted, and that creates the first real space for individuality to, tentatively emerge.
It sounds essential, but if it's only reactive, it means your identity is still defined by the thing you were fighting. You're just looking in the rearview mirror the whole time.
You've hit the nail on the head. Think about it. Look at historical movements or even individual psychoanalysis. Karl Marx, for instance. His entire focus was on revolution against exploitative social and economic structures.
Right, breaking the chains of the past.
It was all about freedom from. And similarly, a lot of psychoanalysis deals primarily with escaping past trauma or conditioning. And while that's necessary for liberation, it's an incomplete freedom.
Because you're still tethered.
You're still tethered. As the material points out, when you fight something, you often unconsciously adopt the energy, the tactics, and the mindset of your enemy. You're connected to the past by the very act of fighting it. This means the freedom you gain is, it's merely an appearance of truth, never the true state.
And this struggle, this success in breaking free, it inevitably leads to a sense of emptiness. You might win the battle against the external enemy, but then you suddenly realize you're standing in this vast, empty field.
Yes.
That's where the second dimension comes in, right? Freedom for.
The sources explain this so clearly. Once the cage is gone, a sadness descends if you lack direction. Freedom from is the destruction of the prison walls. Freedom for is deciding what you're going to build in their place.
So it's future-oriented.
Exactly. It's focused on creative expression. Freedom for sculpting, for dancing, for discovering your own potential, for writing poetry. You have to take this new opportunity and become a creator or a discoverer.
Okay, so now we have the revolutionary, which is freedom from.
Yeah.
And the visionary, or the utopian, which is freedom for. They both sound noble, but they're still defined by something external, aren't they?
They are.
The revolutionary is tethered to the battle he just won, and the visionary is tethered to the dream he hasn't realized yet.
Precisely. Both are ultimately incomplete and, maybe surprisingly, still ego-driven. Freedom from requires a monumental ego to defy authority, right?
Of course.
And freedom for is tied to desire and ambition, the desire to do great things, to achieve some future goal. And the mind, which is what generates all these goals and desires, is defined in this philosophy as the source of our bondage. You're occupied, but you're not yet fulfilled. The dreams can inspire you, but they don't solve the fundamental problem of just living in the present moment.
Okay, this feels like the real pivot point. If both reaction and ambition fall short, Where is the ultimate destination? This must be the third side you mentioned.
Yeah.
Just freedom.
This is the essence of it. This is what you could call transcendental or mystical freedom. It stands entirely outside that linear timeline of past reaction or future desire.
So it's not dependent on destroying the past
No,
or on wanting to do something in the future.
not at all. It is simply to be yourself. It is utterly, completely present-oriented. You're not for or against any time frame. You're just absorbed totally in this moment.
But I have to push back a little here. To be yourself sounds incredibly simple, almost like a cliche you'd see on a poster. If we're born with it, why does it feel so profoundly difficult to achieve?
Because that inherent freedom, the self we are born with, it gets buried under layers and layers of conditioning. We are conditioned by religion, politics, education, social expectations to be certain things, to act in certain ways. True freedom is the shedding of all of that accumulated identity. It means being neither American nor Asian, neither Christian nor atheist, but just pure, innocent consciousness. The material defines this state as the ultimate experience of life. It's the natural flow that happens when you're centered and rooted in your true existential self.
So the goal isn't acquisition, it's subtraction. It's not about reaching for freedom, but removing the obstacles you've placed around the freedom you already possess.
And that's a perfect way to put it.
Which leads to this truly mind-bending concept from the sources, that freedom from oneself is the ultimate freedom.
This is the Zen paradox. It's beautiful. If the self you identify with, the I, is merely an arbitrary, artificial construct built by society and your own mind, then the very last chain you must break is the chain of that artificial self.
It's the ultimate act of letting go.
It is. Through deep awareness, you realize the self is just an idea. You know, Buddhist teaching wasn't know thyself, like Socrates said, but simply know. Just be aware. If you look inside with pure, unclouded awareness, the personalized self just dissolves into this oceanic consciousness. The greatest freedom is to let existence express itself spontaneously through you, rather than through the filter of a manufactured ego.
So if the ego is the idea, and the self is existence expressing itself, then getting rid of the idea is the only way to allow the reality to flow. That's powerful. But now we have to face reality, which is messy. How does this concept of absolute internal freedom survive contact with the real world? We have to address the confusion between inner versus outer freedom.
And this is a point that requires real clarity because it's where a lot of people get stuck. The sources insist that the outer life must always inevitably be a compromise.
Always.
Always. Why? Because we live in interdependence. We are not solitary islands. Absolute external independence is a myth, a fantasy. For example, if you decide you are absolutely free and you refuse to adhere to traffic rules,
You become a danger to yourself and everyone else.
exactly. Your freedom immediately interferes with millions of other people's freedoms.
Right. And the examples are everywhere, from traffic rules to the most fundamental biological processes. I mean, we exchange oxygen with trees. We need our neighbors to be quiet so we can sleep at night. We are, by definition, related.
And the enlightened view, according to this philosophy, is that this interdependence shouldn't be seen as a chain or as bondage. It should be viewed as brotherhood and relatedness. A person who has achieved absolute inner freedom through witnessing and awareness, they accept this outer compromise joyously. Joyously. They don't see the need for compromise as an assault on their being because their inner kingdom is completely untouchable.
Wait, I need to understand that transition. If I am inwardly free, why does that make me okay with waiting in traffic? That seems like a huge leap.
The rebellion against interdependence is fueled by the false entity, the ego. The ego thrives on separation. It feels threatened by any perceived constraint or limitation.
Of course, that's its whole game.
But when the ego dissolves in awareness, you realize you are the whole. The outer life is no longer this constant struggle between me and them. Instead, the interdependence becomes a beautiful dance, a mutual exchange. Your surrender to external natural limitations like gravity or, yes, traffic, isn't born of weakness. It's born of total inner strength and freedom. Only the truly free person can surrender because they have nothing left to lose but that fictional self.
Okay, if the ego is the inner mechanism that resists this flow and interdependence, let's look at the ultimate external structure that has historically maintained that resistance, the traditional authoritative concept of God. The sources present this profound critique they call the problem with God and the puppet master.
This is a fundamental challenge to, well, the Abrahamic tradition, really. If we accept the premise that God created man, the necessary implication is that man is nothing more than a slave, a toy, or a puppet. If God controls every action, every joy, every suffering, then God becomes the greatest dictator imaginable.
And if God is pulling the strings, then the whole concept of enlightenment or spiritual growth becomes completely meaningless. Why would you even try to achieve freedom if your destiny is already predetermined by some divine plan?
Exactly. The human being loses all inherent dignity and all responsibility. The source material argues that this traditional concept of God negates the very possibility of true self-determination. If you pray, you are only praying to the dictator for mercy. You can't transcend the system if the system's creator is also its absolute controller.
This brings us right to Nietzsche's declaration of God's death. He removed the puppeteer, which was this necessary intellectual act of liberation, but the result was, well, it was devastating. Man is left utterly empty.
It creates an immediate existential vacuum, a huge one. If there's no divine creator, then why are we here? What's the point? For the philosophical movement that came after existentialism, fueled by thinkers like Sartre and Camus, the answer was terrifying.
That we're an accident.
Yes, man is free, but free to be an accident. Life becomes meaninglessness, which leads to anguish, anxiety, and dread. The world is reduced to just dead, unintelligent matter, and our existence is just a brief, unimportant spark on the edge of cosmic indifference.
So on one hand, you have the idea of God making us slaves, and on the other, you have existentialism making us accidents. Both positions fundamentally strip the human being of any inherent dignified purpose.
And that's why the sources are so adamant that Nietzsche's destruction of the old lies, heaven, hell, the dictatorial God, was only half the job. It was positive, absolutely, but leaving that vacuum unfilled will inevitably lead humanity to madness. We need the other side of the coin, which is a science to transform consciousness, not just an intellectual declaration of freedom.
And that science is Zen and the resulting roots in existence. If there is no external creator giving us purpose, then the purpose must be found internally in our connection to the cosmos.
Zen is introduced precisely because it has no God, no dogma, no priesthood. It offers methodologies, a science for inner transformation. Through profound awareness, one reaches a point where committing evil isn't just morally wrong, but it's impossible. It becomes an internal, spontaneous commandment that just arises from clarity.
And this clarity shifts our entire perception of the universe.
Yeah.
It's no longer just dead matter, but an intelligent, conscious existence.
That is the core realization. If one is clean, clear, and unconditioned, they realize they're not an accident at all. The sources explain it as this deep, profound recognition. Existence needs you. If you were missing, a unique flavor would be gone that no one else could possibly replace.
I know.
This realization moves beyond that existential dread and implants the human being with true dignity and deep cosmic roots. Your life becomes an essential expression of the whole.
That reframes our entire place in the universe. We're the highest evolution of existence, and when we achieve that state of no-mind intelligence, existence celebrates because it has reached its ultimate potential through us.
And this connection means you cannot act against life because you are a part of it. If we possess intelligence, then the universe itself must be intelligent. We are not aliens floating in some hostile, meaningless cosmos. We are wired directly into a conscious, inexhaustible source of ecstasy. Finding meaning is not about finding an external master. It's about discovering that vital conscious thread connecting you to the whole.
This realization of rootedness is accessed through practice, which brings us to part 3. We have to define meditation. Quality of being versus contemplation. The traditional Western concept of meditation, as we sort of touched on earlier, is often confused with something else entirely.
The distinction is vital. In the West, meditation is often contemplation. You're reflecting on a holy text, on God, on love, or on a philosophical problem. It involves content, ideas, thinking.
So the mind is active.
Very active. Eastern meditation, as it's defined here, is the absolute opposite. It's about dropping all content, achieving a state of godless stillness, a complete no mind. It's about being utterly empty, present, and conscious.
The sources offer that linguistic insight that I found fascinating. The words meditation and medicine share the same root. This suggests meditation is temporary, a remedial tool.
Precisely. It is a device you use only until the essential quality, the state of awareness, is learned. Once the patient is cured, they don't need the medicine anymore. Meditation is ultimately not a doing. It's not a ritual or a posture you hold, but a state of being, or, non-doing. The goal is for it to become a kind of climate that saturates your life 24 hours a day.
That's a profound shift. We're not talking about carving out 30 minutes a day for a practice. We're talking about turning your entire existence into a conscious event. walking, cooking, talking, even sleeping, all saturated with this relaxed awareness.
The beginner requires specific methods, of course. Dynamic meditations, sitting, watching the breath. But the master integrates the state. For the true meditator, there's no separation between the action and the awareness of the action. This leads us directly to the role of mindfulness and awareness as the means to achieve this continuous climate.
Buddha called this right mindfulness, samasati. But what is this rightness? The materials suggest it's paradoxical because it involves no mind. If mindfulness is perfect awareness, how can it simultaneously mean the disappearance of the thinking mind?
That is the core paradox. Mindfulness is achieved when the constant chatter of thoughts disappears. The mind, which is the repository of judgment, memory, comparison, it just ceases to function. What's left is a crystal clear mirror reflecting reality without any distortion. It's called right, not because it conforms to some moral code, but because all judgments, right and wrong, good and bad, have dissolved. You just look at life innocently, without prejudice.
I see. But we live in a world that is obsessed with goals. If I decide I want to achieve right mindfulness, I've already failed, haven't I?
Absolutely. The sources caution very strongly that mindfulness cannot be a goal. Setting a goal immediately creates desire, anxiety, and a future orientation, which pulls you out of the only place where true awareness exists, the present moment.
The here and now.
You can only be mindful. You cannot strive for it. Striving is the mind's last-ditch effort to control the whole process.
So the path is simple, innocent, and inherently possessed by everyone. The only step is becoming aware of your awareness itself, pulling the energy away from external thoughts and directing it inward.
And this awareness functions like a transforming fire. It's not a moral regulator, it's a clarifying force. The key is incredibly simple. Whatsoever deepens when you observe it with awareness is virtue. Joy, love, creativity, these blossom. Whatsoever dissolves when you observe it with awareness is sin.
So things like hatred, anger.
Hatred, anger, jealousy, fear. They cannot survive in the light of awareness. They are merely darkness that disappears when the light is brought in. Awareness is life energy to the good and death energy to the bad.
This sounds almost magical, but it grounds morality in a kind of physics, not in some external commandment. It shifts the burden of proof entirely inward. For awareness to be continuous, however, the sources emphasize it, has to become utterly effortless.
Yes, because effort is tiring, and anything based on effort will be temporary. The anecdote of Gautam Buddha mechanically waving away a fly while he was answering a question is so critical here.
Right.
Even that small, unconscious action represented a momentary failure of awareness, which he immediately regretted. It illustrates that every action, no matter how small, the rising of your hand, the shifting of your foot, must be filled with grace and intention.
That's the difference between a conscious master and an inner robot. If we're acting mechanically, we're just tools. To move from being a loose bag of disparate thoughts to a crystallized center, we have to make every small motion intentional, turning the energy inward. I mean, when you consciously focus your awareness on your hand, the mind, for that one moment, it has to stop its internal thought process.
That continuous I am presence is the essence of mastery. The moment you are conscious, you are centered. The moment you are unconscious, you are lost in the periphery of thoughts. The ultimate step is simply turning inward. A simple movement, yet the hardest one because society trains us only to look outward.
Let's discuss the critical synergy required for this mastery: awareness and relaxation. The sources state they are completely inseparable.
They are two sides of the same coin, absolutely. And understanding the root of tension is key here. Tension is fundamentally your identification with the mind's narratives, fears of death, anxiety about the future, attachment to thoughts.
And the body just follows the mind.
Since the body and mind are a single system, mental tension inevitably translates into physical tension. It manifests as knots in the stomach, the shoulders, or the face.
So if I start with awareness, I automatically pull back from the mind's stories, and the body relaxes as a natural consequence. But starting with relaxation can be difficult. Why is that?
Because the effort to relax itself often creates tension. You're trying to force relaxation, which is a total contradiction. The recommended methodology is scientific and progressive. Start with the circumference, the body. The source suggests consciously communicating with tense parts, gently telling them, relax, just let go. It has to be done lovingly, not aggressively.
And if the body listens, the path inward opens up.
Exactly. Once the body is relaxed, you move inward to the mind, quieting the thoughts, then to the heart, quieting the emotions. Only when all three, body, mind, and heart, are relaxed can you finally reach the innermost core of your being. That innermost core is total relaxation. It's the state of enlightenment, where you align with the effortless flow of existence itself.
I love that analogy in the material. The stars, the trees, the rivers, they all move, but they are utterly relaxed. No hurry, no haste, no worry, and no waste. Only man is the exception, constantly struggling against his own nature because of the mind's identification with fear and control. We've established that the ultimate obstacle to this relaxed awareness is the ego. We need a really clear understanding of the nature and mechanism of the ego, because it's so often confused with the self.
And the sources make a very clear distinction. The self is intrinsic. The ego is the periphery. A child is born with the self, but the ego is developed through social conditioning. It's the boundary layer where we relate to others.
So it's reflective.
It arises reflectively, yes. The child first perceives the thou, the mother, the world, and only by comparison and distinction does the I emerge. The ego is the reflection, not the reality.
And society doesn't just tolerate this reflection, it actively cultivates it. Why is the ego so essential for societal structures?
Because the ego can be taught. It can be forced, made docile, and obedient. You can condition an ego to follow rules, to go to war, or to work an unpleasant job. The true self, conversely, is intrinsically rebellious, individual, and unconditioned. It cannot be forced.
So the ego becomes the necessary structure for control.
It does. It's described as surrounding our intelligence like a thick layer of darkness around a light, effectively creating a closed citadel, a prison around the vast open potential of our consciousness.
If the ego is artificial, how does it sustain itself? What is its lifeblood?
The ego exists entirely through friction. Specifically, the tension between what you are, the reality, and what you want to be, the ideal. If you're poor but you strive to be rich, or if you feel ignorant but you seek knowledge for recognition, that conflict is what feeds the ego. The struggle, the dissatisfaction with the present self is its only energy source. The ego dies only when that conflict ceases, when one accepts, I am fine as I am, existence's will is my will.
But wait, that seems so counterintuitive to our culture, which is that friction and striving are necessary for progress. If I accept myself entirely, doesn't that just lead to lethargy, mediocrity, and complacency? Where does motivation come from if not from the friction between the ideal and the real?
That is the essential insight of this philosophy. True, conscious action comes from wholeness and acceptance, not from friction. Striving for an ideal is always a mind game. The ego is insidious. It uses even noble ideals, like achieving egolessness, to strengthen itself.
Yeah, how does that work?
The pursuit of egolessness creates a more subtle, more decorated, more pious ego. It often leads to arrogance in disguise. The man who is truly egoless is the man of no ideals. Without that tension, the energy that was wasted on conflict becomes available for pure, spontaneous, conscious action.
So without conflict, without the internal struggle of one part of the self arguing with another, the ego starves. It's a tension that makes us unconscious, keeping us sort of intoxicated in a state of inner warfare.
Yes. And this leads to a fascinating paradox, which is particularly relevant for spiritual seekers. Before one can lose the ego, they must attain it.
That seems like the biggest stumbling block of all. How can you strive to attain the very thing you need to lose? It sounds impossible.
You must be ripe. The sources use the analogy of a fruit. Only a ripe fruit falls naturally to the ground. If Eastern traditions preach egolessness to someone whose ego is weak, undeveloped, or fragmented, perhaps due to childhood trauma or repressive conditions, the attempt to dissolve it will fail. Because the effort to drop the weak ego only strengthens it in subtle, complicated ways. You're trying to drop something you haven't fully possessed or understood.
Whereas in the West, where the focus has been on building a strong, individuated ego for achievement and competition, when the seeker finally realizes the ego is the problem, the structure is robust enough to be dissolved completely.
It's easier to lose something tangible you have fully built than to lose a ghost you barely grasp. The ego isn't a substance you can just throw away. It's a notion, an idea, a shadow. You can only dissolve it by watching its mechanism in full clarity. When awareness, which is light, comes, the shadow simply disappears. You have to allow the ego to reach its peak before the realization that it is empty can dawn.
Now let's connect the ego to its primary defensive instrument, fear.
Fear is the total antithesis of true freedom, and it is meticulously imposed by society, the church, and the state precisely because it guarantees compliance and inhibits rebellion. But fundamentally, fear is always rooted in desire.
Can you elaborate on that connection? If I fear death, how is that rooted in desire?
The fear of death is the fear of losing your separation, losing the ego you built. The fear of poverty is the desire for wealth or status. The fear of public speaking is the desire for approval or recognition. If you had no desire for wealth or fame, the corresponding fear simply couldn't exist. Desire is the seed. Fear is the shadow it casts.
The sources give a radically non-conventional instruction on handling fear. Don't fight it, but rather allow the fear.
Fighting fear is the ego's response, and it just doubles the tension. The instruction is to watch the fear, allow it to possess you completely without judging it or trying to escape it. When you allow it totally, you observe its beauty, delicacy, and sensitivity. Fear is a profound, subtle aliveness. And in that intense, allowed turmoil, you suddenly become aware of an innermost core, a witness that is absolutely untouched by the cyclone of fear.
And if the fear cannot touch that core, then the ultimate fear, death, cannot touch it either.
Precisely. This untouched core is the deathless self. The old instinct is to follow fear, to run away, to choose cowardice, which simply lets your potential go rotten. Choosing courage means going against the fear instinct. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move despite it. Courage kills the old, limited self, allowing the new, authentic self to sprout. It transforms a degrading human experience into a doorway to understanding.
Moving from the self to the interaction with others, we have to examine love. State of being versus relationship. Again, the common definition is completely upended here.
True love is defined not as a transaction or an arrangement, but as a spiritual experience, a state of being. You don't fall into love, you are love. It's a spontaneous, joyous consequence of having known the self through meditation and awareness. It's a reward and overflowing that occurs once you have found your own center.
And this state requires the capacity to be joyously alone, which is totally counter to the romantic ideal that love comes and fills a void.
If you are alone, you don't need the other person to complete you, only to share your fullness with. Real love actually makes you more centered, more rooted, an island surrounded by an ocean of connection. The lover becomes a perfect mirror, showing you your original face, your beauty, and your flaws, forcing awareness upon you.
But the vast majority of people, lacking this inner completion, seek love through establishing a defined structure. And the sources claim that relationship destroys love.
Yes, love is unstructured, it is flow, it's moment to moment. A relationship is a fixed, structured concept used by unloving people as a substitute. It's an attempt to create a monopoly, possessiveness, and security where none naturally exists.
It's like trying to bottle lightning.
Exactly. When the flowing energy of love is forced into the rigid container of a relationship, it dies. The love quickly turns into a struggle for power, demands, expectations, and bondage. You stop seeing the other person and you start seeing the role they play in your structure.
So the progression of intimacy, according to Buber, moves from it, which is the purely sexual body-focused act, to itha, which is relationship and dialogue. But the source material defines a third, even higher state.
That highest state is prayerfulness or communion. This is where the I and the Tao entirely disappear. The two people stop relating as separate entities and start functioning as one unified soul in two bodies, a tremendous, seamless unity. At this level, love has to become utterly passionless and without attachment. When love is liberated from need and possessiveness, it transforms from a source of potential suffering into a divine liberation.
The ultimate expression of this structural dependency is the institution of marriage and its flaws.
Marriage is described as a dead thing, an institutionalized contract backed by external authorities, the police, the courts, society, all offering security. True love is inherently insecure and demands constant courage and awareness. Marriage is social, love is individual. Marriage is simply a substitute designed to provide permanence where nature intends flow.
And the typical marriage, based on that initial state of falling in love, is basically destined for failure because it's built on a lie.
When two people fall in love, they're in a state of intoxication. They only present their beautiful, idealized selves, meticulously hiding their neuroses and their ugliness. The foundation is false from the start. And when the intoxication wears off and reality sets in and the ugliness is revealed, the structure, which is built on expectation and illusion, just collapses.
This brings us to the crucial difference in motivation. To love versus to need love.
Most people are fundamentally longing for love. This longing is a childish need carried over from infancy, the desire to be fed, warmed, and affirmed. It makes the person dependent and needy.
Whereas
Loving is a mysterious, mature act. It has to be an overflowing quality, like breathing. You don't direct your breathing to a specific person, you just breathe because you are alive. If your love is only addressed to one specific person, you immediately confine and destroy its unconditional nature. It must be a quality in you that flows outwards universally.
If love is an overflowing state, we have to address the traditional conflict between spirit and body. Conventional religion has historically repressed the body, especially sex. This is where the concept of Tantra as transformation and acceptance offers a radical solution.
Tantra is defined as the natural way to God, the science that transforms ordinary lovers into soulmates. And its core principle is radical, total affirmation, accept whatsoever you are. It accepts the body, it accepts sex, not as something to be endured or transcended by denial, but as something sacred, holy, and a primary vehicle for consciousness.
And this approach stands in direct contrast to traditional yoga, which is often seen as the default path to spirituality.
The distinction is crucial. Yoga is effort and negation. It is rooted in duality, splitting reality into the lower, which is the body and the material, and the higher, the soul and the spiritual. It involves fighting against the current of nature, striving intensely for the unnatural.
Whereas Tantra,
Tantra is affirmation and effortlessness. It emphasizes surrendering to nature and moving with the energy flow. Tantra teaches that sexuality and spirituality are simply two ends of the same energy continuum. The body is the starting point for transcendence, not the enemy.
so if yoga says master the body, Tantra says accept the body and its energy will carry you upward. How does this acceptance manifest in the sexual act?
Yeah.
This leads us to sex, awareness, and orgasm.
In Tantra, sex is used instrumentally, but the transformation depends entirely on awareness. You must remain alert, a silent watcher, during the act. Most sex is performed blindly, unconsciously, driven by momentary biological need. Tantra requires you to be fully present, not attempting to control or hurry the flow, but allowing the energy to rise with complete consciousness. This sustained awareness transforms the physical act into a prayerful, meditative state of samadhi.
The sources draw a very clear line between mere ejaculation and true orgasm.
Ejaculation is local. It's a release of tension. True orgasm, in the tantric sense, is the involvement of the total being, mind, body, and soul. It's a peak moment where control is entirely lost and existence takes possession of you. This loss of control is terrifying to the ego, which is why most people rush through the experience. The deepest orgasmic peaks, we learn, are connected more to silence than to the sexual act itself. Being meditative creates the internal stillness necessary for that total explosive merger.
The material also delves into the historical and cultural repression inherent in sexuality, particularly focusing on the unique position of women.
And the critique here is sharp. Man has historically dominated and crippled women, denying them the opportunity to fully blossom. The sources suggest the world has missed out on potentially thousands of Buddhas or Einsteins due to this suppression. And this male dominance stems from a deep unconscious inferiority complex.
An inferiority complex. How so?
Man cannot give birth to life, which is defined as the highest creative act. Since man cannot perform that function, domination and reducing women to a secondary category became the cultural mechanism to overcome this deep-seated feeling of inadequacy. It was a projection of power to mask a profound natural limitation.
And this imbalance has been amplified by exploiting physiological differences in sexuality.
Yes, women are described as infinitely superior in sexuality, capable of multiple total body orgasms. Man's orgasm, by contrast, is local and singular. The tragedy is that man, driven by local tension relief and often hurry, uses the woman as a means to his own end, finishing quickly before she has even begun her ascent. This creates mutual dissatisfaction and perpetuates the imbalance.
This cultural misunderstanding is even reflected in practices like the common Western missionary posture.
The sources criticize this posture as the heavier man crushing a delicate being, limiting her mobility, and making mutual synchronized orgasm difficult. They advocate for Eastern practices, such as the woman being on top, which brings the orgasms closer together, encouraging full involvement and a shared spiritual peak.
The conclusion, then, is that women's liberation is automatically men's liberation.
Absolutely. The current male-centric conditioning cripples both genders. Men are taught they cannot cry, cannot be soft, cannot express feminine traits, forcing them into constant aggressiveness and creating deep neurosis, which ultimately fuels war and societal imbalance. A liberated society would allow both men and women to be total human beings, sometimes soft, sometimes expressive, sometimes aggressive, depending on the situation, not on imposed gender roles.
We shift now from the internal liberation to the external structures of control. The sources present a very, very strong claim about the conspiracy against humanity.
The claim is that priests and politicians form a mafia of the soul, perpetually conspiring to keep humanity in bondage. They operate a symbiotic relationship. The politician controls the worldly, material life, and the priest controls the inner, spiritual life. Both crave power, not service.
And the mechanism for control is simple. Keep people enslaved and dependent.
Yes. Organized religions fight endless, often disguised, wars for dominance and power. Politicians maintain their control by keeping people economically poor and intellectually unawakened. If people become wealthy and intelligent, they become difficult to enslave, harder to convince with false promises, and more challenging to purchase during elections. Furthermore, the politician is often driven by a sickness, a deep inferiority complex that seeks ambition merely to prove superiority, masking a wound or a feeling of worthlessness.
Given this critical assessment of the current systems, the sources propose an entirely radical alternative, the meritocracy alternative. They argue the cunning criminal political system hiding behind the masks of democracy must be replaced.
The core argument against democracy is that it gives power to the power-hungry, mediocre majority. Merit, not the ability to gather votes through manipulation and false promises, should be the only decisive factor in governance. Democracy, in its current form, is seen as leading humanity toward disaster because mediocre leaders are making decisions that affect the entire planet.
And the proposal is revolutionary. Power should shift from politicians to the intelligentsia.
The future belongs to those who have demonstrated actual caliber, the scientists, artists, poets, thinkers. These people, whom the sources refer to as objective religion, are driven by creation, curiosity, and service, not by the sickness of ambition. Their merit is defined by their proven ability to share, serve, and solve real-world problems. They have no personal egoistic need for ambition.
But how could such a transition happen? It seems completely utopian in a world obsessed with voting rights.
The argument is that the current political path, fueled by ego-driven politicians, is leading the world to the brink of death global suicide through ever-improving weapons and environmental destruction. This ultimate crisis, likely within a few decades, will force humanity to choose between transformation, which is meritocracy, and total annihilation. It will become a necessity, not just an ideal. The initial step suggested is for universities and intelligentsia to stop honoring politicians and start convening conventions to decide how merit can practically govern society, pushing the discussion into the mainstream intellectual sphere.
Finally, we have to look at how we approach reality intellectually, contrasting philosophy versus reality.
Philosophy is dismissed as entirely anti-reality. It's categorized as rational gymnastics and an obsession with words. It is the constant effort to think about the truth, which is fundamentally impossible. You either know reality through experience or you don't. Thinking only creates more questions and never provides a single answer. The sources paint the image of philosophy as the blind man's effort, searching for a black cat which is not there.
It sounds like a rejection of the intellect itself.
Not of intelligence, but of the thinking mind's insistence on using doubt as the primary tool. Philosophy is rooted in doubt. Religion, in this context, is defined as experience, or knowing, and is rooted in trust. The approach to reality should be through the heart, which trusts the spontaneous flow of existence, not the head, which constantly doubts and compartmentalizes. When the mind disappears through meditation, all philosophy disappears with it because the mind is its breeding ground.
We've covered the internal and external conflicts. Let's bring this wisdom to bear on the most pervasive forms of modern suffering, starting with handling depression in the opposite states.
Depression is diagnosed here as a phenomenon unique to the developed world, largely caused by the failure of hope. Political ideologies, religious promises, and materialist goals, the utopias we were promised, have all failed. When people achieve their goals, wealth, fame, comfort, and still find themselves miserable and empty, they realize there's nowhere left to go. The road ends, leading to darkness and meaninglessness.
So achieving the goal is often the actual cause of the depression because it reveals the goal's inadequacy.
And physiologically, depression is fundamentally defined as repression, unexpressed anger, unexpressed sexuality, unexpressed greed, or just a general lack of authentic expression. The healthy, conscious approach is radical acceptance. When depressed, be depressed. Don't fight it, don't try to be happy, don't mask it. Fighting it creates a secondary false depression, which leads to these infinite, destructive mental grooves. By simply allowing the state to be, you wait for the natural change, understanding that life moves in cycles, like the sun rising and setting.
And the easiest way to break the high-low cycle, surprisingly, is not to focus awareness on the depressive downs, but on the moments of ecstasy.
Yes, that is the master key. When you are flowing with joy, blissfulness, or creativity, that is the moment to be fully aware. Awareness intensifies and enhances the high. If awareness is continuously maintained during those joyful peaks, the depressive lows simply will not come. Awareness, being light, prevents the darkness of depression and unconsciousness from accumulating. It is the simplest door out of misery.
Next, we address the ultimate certainty. Death. We have to examine the celebration of death. Why is the fear of death so paralyzing for so many?
We fear death for two main reasons. First, we only ever view it from the outside. The physical symptoms, the heart stopping. We never view it as an internal experience of the innermost being. Second, and more importantly, we fear it because we haven't truly lived. We cling to life because we are still preparing to live. Death approaches while we are still gathering our notes.
But for those who have lived totally and intensely, they redefine death completely. It ceases to be the end.
It becomes the crescendo or the ultimate climax of a life fully lived. If one has lived totally, death is described as the ultimate orgasm, a deep transfer of the soul, or a dissolution into the universal whole. The fear of death disappears entirely when you realize you are not separate from existence, and that the only thing that dies is the ego, the personality you artificially cultivated. The true self is deathless. It's eternity itself.
This requires an attitude of totality, bringing us to the unconditional attitude of celebration.
Celebration is not conditional on circumstances. It is not something you do if you are happy. True celebration is an unconditional attitude of gratefulness for whatsoever existence gives happiness or unhappiness, joy or sorrow. It is the core attitude that says life in its totality is good and is accepted.
A person who truly celebrates must be living this moment totally, which means they have no future.
Because the future only arises when you postpone life, when you are miserable and you're waiting for tomorrow to bring happiness. A celebrating person lives here and now, experiencing every moment fully. Celebration is the outward manifestation of inner silence. You have to reach a silence so deep that you can understand the cosmic joke of existence, allowing every single moment to become a festival, a conscious dance.
To sustain this unconditional life, the overarching quality required is trust and the total experience.
Trust is defined as unconditional and purely subjective. It is not addressed to an object. It's not trusting in someone because they are trustworthy, but simply trusting because you find the act of trusting internally joyous. It is an inner quality, an invincible light that once kindled shines on everything: love, truth, beauty, insecurity, and even death.
So if someone betrays me, my trust isn't destroyed. Rather, it's strengthened because the deception could not corrupt my intrinsic capacity to trust.
Precisely. If you trust yourself at your deepest core, you trust the whole of life. The whole you came from, the whole that surrounds you, and the whole into which you will dissolve. Trust means surrender, not born of weakness, but of ultimate strength. It means whatever happens, we are with it joyously, because existence, being conscious and intelligent, cannot fundamentally go wrong. You are ready to surrender to the flow.
What an immense journey. We've moved from the conditional, conflict-driven idea of freedom to the realization that true liberation is simply being yourself, rooted in present, choiceless awareness.
And that this requires dissolving the ego, which thrives on friction and fear, and transforming relationships into states of unconditional love and communion.
The path remains wholly internal, a matter of self-realization that really transcends history. As the source material so beautifully noted, after self-knowledge, there's no autobiography or biography, because all events before awakening just dissolve into a dream sequence.
The ultimate message is not to remember the messenger, but to remember yourself, to cultivate that inner light.
The ultimate transformation is the shift from being a slave to external structures, a function, a utility, to becoming a crystallized center, a master of one's own being.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought, something for you to mull over. If a robot can perform every utility function, cooking, cleaning, working, and even simulating emotion, but the one thing it cannot do is achieve meditation, then if you are not cultivating continuous conscious awareness, have you truly transformed your life? Or are you simply fulfilling a function, waiting to be needed, rather than being a joy and a conscious dance unto yourself? We'll leave that with you until our next deep dive.